Every agreement that China has ever signed, be it economic or diplomatic, they have broken. Xi Jinping is not an aberration. Xi Jinping is just a pure expression of what the party wants. He's going to retake Taiwan. He wants to exert influence in his near abroad. He wants the party supreme. He has 1.5 million people just to police the Chinese people. Britain, in my opinion, is very far behind in really being honest about the seriousness and the depth of the threat.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today we'll be discussing US-China relations, the future of China's economy under Xi Jinping, and the role of trade in geopolitics. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Mary Kissel, who is Executive Vice President at the investment bank Stephens. She is also the former senior advisor to US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and before that spent 14 years working for the Wall Street Journal, running their Hong Kong editorial page. So, Mary Kissel, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Daniel.
Yeah. So, to start off, I thought I'd ask you to summarize quite a big topic, which is, what is the state of US-China relations today?
Well, again, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with you, and I'm glad we're starting at 10,000 feet with the easy question. I would say that the state of US-China relations, and by the way, this is how China wants us to think of them, is in bilateral terms. That's to their advantage. I don't think that's how we should think of it, but I'll answer your question to start, is complicated. The United States, for many decades, over successive Republican and Democrat administrations, encouraged U.S. investment, particularly in the mainland, in the hope that that investment and liberalization would lead to a change in their political system. And with the rewriting of the U.S. national security strategy in 2017, 2018, in the first Trump term, we actually looked at reality and we said, effectively, the war on terror is not over, but we have neglected the real threat to our national interest, and those are nation states that want to dominate us, and that includes China, Russia, Iran, that in fact we had taken our eye off the ball since the fall of the Soviet Union and neglected to prepare ourselves for these adversaries. It doesn't mean that we don't care about terrorism anymore. We certainly do, and we fight it all over the world. But we need a reality check. And every agreement that China has ever signed, be it economic or diplomatic, they have broken. We need to recognize that the economic liberalization that was so heralded wasn't real. It's a communist regime. They don't recognize property rights. You never had independent boards or private shareholder activist groups or free media or all of those institutions that you need to have a truly private economy. And so President Trump in the first term said we want fair and reciprocal treatment, which is what we would expect of any other trading relationship. And what we found, of course, is that we once again got a lesson in the nature of the regime in Beijing. The president spent several years trying to do the Phase 1 trade deal, which Beijing signed and then promptly ignored. And that's just on the economic front, Daniel. We then had, in the middle of the first term, of course, the COVID outbreak. And I was in the State Department at that time, dealing with that alongside the secretary, and we offered assistance to the regime. We offered to send Centers for Disease Control personnel, epidemiologists, doctors, you name it. And Beijing didn't want any help at all. In fact, they took actions that, in hindsight, helped spread the disease by allowing Chinese citizens to continue to travel to then Belt and Road countries, places like Pakistan and India. And so I think, through those experiences, but also kind of the campaign of education that we embarked on, to simply tell the truth, not in a partisan way, just in a fact-based way about many aspects of the regime, about their treatment of the Uyghurs, about their campaign to insert Huawei and other surveillance devices into our secure networks all over the world, if they're corrupting of international institutions. That's why you saw, because of their actions, a real change in the United States first, but then in the rest of the world to recognize in a nonpartisan way the nature of the regime and to take it seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that was a necessary thing, not just for the national security of the United States, but also for the economic behavior of our publicly held companies that are beholden to our shareholders, that have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. And look, some Western and free nations take that threat more seriously than others. Britain, in my opinion, is very far behind in really being honest about the seriousness and the depth of the threat, not just abroad, but on British soil. But we've woken up. And, just to circle back to where I started, and then I'll stop. China wants us to talk about bilateral relationships, but that's not really the problem. The problem is a China-led alliance of Russia, Iran, other rogue states versus the free world and the free world's allies. And that's really the situation that we confront. And so if you want to talk about this very complex and changing situation, I think it's important for us to talk about it realistically and in ways of how the world actually works.
So it's really interesting that you chart the sort of shift to seeing China as an adversary to the first Trump administration and 2018. What is the actual nature of the threat from China, in your view, to the US and other Western countries?
Well, I'll give you one immediate example. This is all public information. It might come as a surprise to your listeners and viewers. And that's the Salt Typhoon hack. Daniel, have you heard of it?
No, I haven't.
Okay. The Salt Typhoon hack and the extent of it became public many months ago. And effectively, what the US federal government agencies revealed is that the Chinese government had infiltrated our core networks to such a degree that they can listen to our phone calls, read our text messages. So think about that. Two-factor authentication is meaningless. That they've burrowed into our critical infrastructure. So think about public utilities or military bases or electricity generating stations. And we don't know what the intent is. Certainly our friends and allies in places like France or Britain don't do these things. And this is very different from some of the infiltrations that we've seen in the past, right? It's one thing to be able to read metadata. It's another to listen to any American's phone call. And that is a five-star alarm within our defense and our intelligence services. And that's just a single example. You have to ask the question. I remember when I was at State, a very close friend of mine, very senior Australian official, came to see me and he said, Mary, Australia has been experiencing these things for years. We are the kind of the canary in the coal mine, if you were. Remember, they had a member of parliament step down because of payments from Chinese officials and interests. They had infiltration of their college campuses. They had the Huawei threat. They were the first ones to wake up to it. And he said, hey, if it's happening to Australia, imagine what they're doing to you at home. So this is just the domestic threat. It is very possible that China could just shut down our networks today. And what would that do to our social order, our social cohesion? Imagine if they did it to you. That's a real threat. It's a different threat. But, all you have to do is look at what they're doing with their military. You have to ask, what are they building? How do they use it as they build it? And what do they say they're going to do in the future? We're talking about a country, pardon me, with a 1 million-man army, the world's largest navy, the third largest air force, 600 nuclear weapons we have no access to, biological and chemical weapons programs. They attack our satellites every day. They cut our cables to the Pacific. You don't have to be a genius to see what this is aimed at. It's certainly not aimed at the territorial protection of China. It's aimed at us. And so, pardon me, I'll do a Marco Rubio and get some water. But we need to just lay these facts out in a very calm and data-driven way and say, okay, that's what they're building. Then you ask, what are they doing?
Yeah.
Well, they're attacking their neighbors, the Philippines, Japan, our naval vessels and aircraft, Australia's aircraft. I mean, they launched missiles that almost hit an Australian passage liner that was flying between Australia and New Zealand just in these last months. And then you have to ask the third question, which is, what do they say they're going to do? Xi Jinping is very clear about that. He's going to retake Taiwan. He wants to exert influence in his near abroad. He wants the party supreme. He has 1.5 million people just to police the Chinese people, right? Bigger than TLA. And he wants to create a world where, China's economy is no longer dependent on ours. He wants to decouple from us. He's been very clear about that. So we need to listen to what he says. We need to observe what they're doing. And then we need to take actions as Western democracies to protect our interests. And so that was the thinking behind that shift in the first Trump term. And that's why you see such bipartisan agreement in the United States and in other countries about the threat that this regime poses, because you can't deny the fact of it and you can't deny their behavior. My friend H.R. McMaster stole a line from me that I've been using for several years, which is that we've got to get away from strategic narcissism, meaning we're always asking questions about us. What are we doing? What are we doing that's affecting someone else? That's fine, but you also have to ask, what is the other side doing? What are they saying? What do they want? And that's what we really need to examine closely if we want to have a sustainable, prosperous, free West.
Yeah. So since 2018, how has the US responded to this perceived threat from China?
It's not a perceived threat, it's a real threat. So that's number one. Because again,
Heinous in the sense that you
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 can't look at
perceive it in that way. You perceive it as a threat
oh,
to
no. No,
US
no, no,
interests
no.
in the
That's not true at all. No, you can't downplay it, Daniel. You have to listen to what General Secretary Xi Jinping says.
Hmm.
It's not a perceived threat. You just read his speeches to the cadres. And also the fact that he refuses to engage in things like trilateral nuclear talks, which both the Trump and the Biden administration have tried to start with him. He's not interested. So, saying perceived is not accurate. It's real. There is no nation in the world that would burrow into our critical infrastructure and to gain the capability to shut it down that's a friend.
Oh, no, I don't think my suggestion is not that China is actually a friend. I'm just saying that the perception of China as being a serious national security threat seems to have grown in the US over the last 5 to 10 years. So my question really is, what have been the US's responses to this?
Well, the responses go across many arena, both public and private. So at Stevens, I talk to a lot of CEOs, major investors, boards of directors about their strategies. And it's not just what happened with COVID or this drumbeat of education and information that we embarked on in Washington. It's also the pullout from Russia that has really woken up the U.S. private sector to the idea that political risk is there, but someday they might have to pull out of China wholesale. And I think that the general public gets a very misleading impression of how U.S. companies think about investing in China because they're only getting coverage of, say, the Fortune 500, right, that have major sunken costs and investment in China. You know, those are companies like Caterpillar, Tesla, Nike, you name it. But there are thousands of more companies that sit underneath there, companies that we see here at Stevens that, have left. And if they haven't left, they're pulling down their operations significantly. I think that that's a prudent reaction, but it is difficult. You'll see think tank people all the time go on U.S. national television and say, well, we should decouple from China. Well, you know what? When you're running a business, that may not be so easy. You have to find another place to produce. You have to find a workforce that can staff your operations. It's complicated. But I think by and large, the only companies that have decided to double down on their China investments are those who feel that their corporate fortunes are inextricably tied. So companies like Intel, for instance, which took U.S. government money, but then goes to China and says that China is the key market, or Tesla, right? Where Elon Musk has aligned himself very closely with the president, done some great things, but then goes to China and says, we really need you. We sell a lot of Tesla cars. But, those are just a couple of examples. I think the vast majority of at least American companies in China are aware of the risk more so than ever and trying to either diversify or divest.
So you talked about the example of the war, Russia as an example that has really sort of kicked a lot of American companies into gear, noting that, if war breaks out, you may have to leave on much worse terms than you can get currently. How much of the US companies pulling out of China currently is driven by that, and how much is being driven by the current administration's tariff policies?
I think um, it's hard to answer that question because you're asking for kind of macro data that I don't have at hand. I don't know if anyone has that. I think a large portion, and I'm just talking to you from my anecdotal experience, is that the COVID lockdown, the 3-year lockdown, plus the pullout from Russia was really a very large impetus. The U.S. government, it doesn't give clear guidance to companies.
Hmm.
Both the Trump 1, the Biden, and the Trump 2 administrations call China a competitor, and that's a nonsense. It's not a competitor. A competitor is, a nation like Mexico or Canada that respects the same rules of the game, and you compete on a fair and level trading field, and that's not what this is. And so that's a difficult step for any president to take, to declare a country an adversary, and it has a lot of cascading consequences, right, when that happens. And it takes an enormous amount of political capital to do it. And so that's why it's been, almost a decade now where we've recognized the nature of this regime, but we haven't been fully honest in terms of our policy about what that implies, right? And part of that reason, Daniel, is because this threat is very different than the ones that we've faced before. With the Soviet Union, the threat was very clear, and it was very contained. The Soviets would go to Belarus or Poland or the Czech Republic, and they'd stamp their system of government on it, and they'd make it look like Moscow. There was an Iron Curtain. There was very little economic interaction. That's not what this is. I mean, think of the Chinese investment in the United States and Britain and the incentives that has created. And also think, too, that a lot of our corporate leaders and investors don't think like military analysts. They're not trained to think that way. You look at our boards. I'm on 2 public company boards. I'm a rarity to be on those boards, right? Most corporate boards in your country and mine are filled with what? They're filled with former CEOs, with operators, tech experts, lawyers, accountants, right? They're not filled with people who have spent a lot of time thinking about, well, gosh, what's the political environment here? How might that change in a good or a bad way? What's the right bet to take 5, 10 years? Because they didn't have to have those people on that kind of argumentation because the world was relatively stable for 30 years.
Hmm.
Uh, but that's not true anymore. And so it's a transitional period. There'll be a lot of mistakes made. But it's an urgent issue for both our governments and both of our corporate and financial sectors to grapple with.
Yeah. How do you respond to those who say that economic interdependence between, say, China and Western countries is actually a stabilizing force because it provides disincentives to the Chinese government to, say, take aggressive actions against Taiwan because there are economic risks that come with that, and those who say that a full decoupling actually reduces the disincentives on the Chinese regime when it comes to aggressive action.
Well, again, it just goes back to that phrase I used earlier, strategic narcissism. Embedded in that question is an assumption that the regime in Beijing has the same values and will react in the same way as we would. This is a totalitarian regime that is committing genocide against the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. Xi Jinping is not an aberration. He was put into power by the party elites that were afraid that the structure of power is becoming too corrupt and the party would lose control over the country and its military. So Xi Jinping is not an aberration. Xi Jinping is just a pure expression of what the party wants. And the party has, what it calls core interests. And it's essentially, number one, is the preservation of power of the party over everything else. So it's not, it's not about helping the Chinese people, which didn't elect them. It's not about engendering, a sustainable, prosperous country, contributes to the world or to regional peace. I mean, it's not. And again, I'm not making it up. You have to listen to what they say in their own official pronouncements and to their own people. And I think their goals are very clear.
Yeah. Although we have seen examples of the CCP responding to public discontent. If you look to the example of the COVID lockdowns, in large part, they eventually backtracked on those because there was mass protest against them. So isn't there some sort of suggestion that, okay, the CCP leadership may be exclusively concerned with maintaining power, but a large part of the legitimacy is built around the idea that they are also giving people improved living standards. And if you do get a collapse in those, it may act as some disincentive.
So we have been awash in CCP propaganda for more than 4 decades. Think of the phraseology that you just used, right? That there's some sort of implicit bargain between the CCP holding power and providing their people economic prosperity, or the idea that they are long-term thinkers with a long-term plan, or that they're interested in win-win outcomes. All of those things are absolutely false. The situation that you just described perfectly exemplifies the dynamics in Beijing. They lifted the lockdowns because they were afraid that social discontent would run out of control and that they would lose power. Now, does that mean that they did it with an eye to, opening up and liberalizing the economy? Well, their behavior has not suggested that at all. If anything, Xi Jinping has reduced some of the, shall we say, constraints or reduced the ability of Chinese companies to engage in the kind of transactions and risk-taking that they want. But really, at the end of the day, all you have to do is look at their legal system, Daniel. I mean, they have something called civil-military fusion, which essentially says that any company that operates in Hong Kong, Macau, mainland China, has to serve the party, and any information, data, et cetera, can be taken at any time because they're beholden to the party. So the idea that there was ever a private sector that was, kind of like ours is just a nonsense. And their track record is what it is. I'd like to be hopeful and believe in unicorns and think that there's a real liberalization instinct there at the upper echelons of the party, but I see no evidence of it.
Okay. So on the question of China's economy in general, what is the state of China's economy, and how has it been affected both by Xi Jinping's policy towards decoupling and by US policy as well?
So many answers to that question. I'll take it in no particular order. Abroad, the Xi regime has spent a lot of time cultivating foreign markets for its goods. There are more countries in the world today where the largest trading partner is China than for the US.
Hmm.
Now, these aren't necessarily big Western democracies. So I mean, we're just talking about raw numbers here. So if you look at the nations of Africa or South America, Central America, those add up.
Yeah.
But that is a significant statistic, and it takes a lot of people by surprise. At home, um, it's almost impossible for us to discern the true state of the economy because we don't have any of the tools that we have in, say, the UK, right? The Western media cannot go wherever it wants. We have no verifiable company reports. We have self-censorship from executives and political leaders because, they could just be thrown in jail if they say the wrong thing. There's no rating agency freedom to go in and ask whoever they want anything that they want. So, in that respect, it's a hard question to answer. That being said, we can observe some trends that are obvious. You look at the collapse of Evergrande, for instance, which was the big property developer that was delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in these last days. The property market suffered from the perverse incentives that we see in any top-down economy. They didn't allocate capital properly. There was corruption. They expanded beyond their core remit, right? They were buying shares in football clubs and theme parks and electric car makers, right? They're not disciplined like a real public company would be. And so we saw the property market collapse. We see that Chinese consumers rightly are reticent to spend money. Why is that? Because think of it in human terms. If you were locked in your apartment block for 3 years, you had a party monitor standing down the hall in a little booth coming to you and saying, hey, you do the wrong thing or look at me the wrong way, I'm going to send you off to Xinjiang. Are you going to go out and buy a new Buick or BYD electric car? Of course you're not. You're going to try to get your money offshore. You're going to try to squirrel it away. You're going to try to provide for yourself and your family. So there are political reasons why household spending is weak and is likely to remain weak. You have a shrinking population. You have unequal treatment of migrant workers. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons, including, and I should say this, and I should have said this at the beginning, just the deep, deep corruption of the whole system. I mean, I would really recommend to any of your listeners to read Red Roulette by Desmond Shum. He's a Hong Kong businessman who did business with the upper echelons of the party, and he wrote an incredibly courageous book about that system and how it works. And really, it's the best insight that we have today into the real state of how the Chinese economy works or doesn't work, and just how deeply that corruption extends. It's a heck of a read, and I just think he's an incredibly courageous person for putting that in print.
Yeah. No, these are all really interesting points. I suppose your emphasis is that don't forget that this is a state run by a communist party, and that a lot of the features of market economies just don't exist in a very straightforward way. Why then is it that standards of living have increased over the last 30 years? I think you wouldn't dispute that there has been significant real growth in this time, even with so much corruption, even with so many extremely flawed institutions. How do you account for this?
Yeah, that's another well-worn propaganda line, Daniel. You have to ask
Has there not been economic growth?
You have to ask that question for it to be accurate. You have to ask, what would China look like today? What would the living standards be if there were no Communist Party? That's the actual question, right?
Oh, that might be a very good question, but I really want to drill down because I think it's important why countries with not just China, but you do get various countries with seemingly incredibly bad institutions, lots of corruption, and yet they do seem to still have some growth. Less than say Taiwan, for example. But why do
Sure. That's a textbook answer because you had free economic zones in places like Shenzhen and Anhui in the north, and you had an opening up of capital, allowing some capital but not controlling capital to come in from the west. You had a freer movement of people from the countryside into the factories. So I think that's very clear. But your question suggests somehow that that the party was responsible for that, but the party wasn't, and the party never believed in it because you just have to, again, you have to cloak it in the political history of the country. The only reason why these things happened is because the Cultural Revolution almost ripped China apart, and it was a last resort that the party turned to do these things. And it doesn't take a genius, right, to say, please invest in our factories. Our cost of labor is a 20th of the rest of the world, and we'll do that. And if you pay us off, we'll allow you to build the factory. I mean, eventually we'll copy it and, we'll kick you out. But for now, come in and do that. I guess my frustration is that, that question is often phrased as well, aren't they great? Isn't this a new kind of capitalism? I mean, you think about, for instance, Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist way back. I think it was 2009 or 2010, and you heard a column and he said, if only the United States could be more like China. Wow, look at this prosperity. Look at how many people they're raising out of poverty. So that's the implicit implication of your question, and I just don't accept it. I mean, the Chinese people are the most productive entrepreneurial people in the world. Our Chinese American community is extraordinary. Taiwan is a free China, and look at all the things that they've invented and what a tolerant and positive influence they have on the world. I mean, you can go around the world and look at any Chinese community outside of mainland China. Look at Hong Kong when it was free under your nation's jurisdiction. I mean, it was a miracle. So, I feel like I'm pushing back hard here, Daniel, but I also want your viewers and listeners to recognize that some of these phrases that we use, right, they're propaganda lines. And we have to be more sophisticated about thinking about the regime and their economic development and their intentions for the future.
Yeah. I suppose if we went back 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, a lot of those who were in favor of, keeping China inside the tent in terms of WTO access and access to trade and investment opportunities in the West would have said economic integration is going to lead to economic liberalization, and then that will inevitably lead to political liberalization. Do you think there was ever a sort of viable alternative universe where that did actually end up happening? Or was it always sort of hopeless?
I don't know if it's a useful question, Daniel. I mean, that didn't happen. It's never happened. James Mann, to give him credit, wrote the China Fantasy back when I was based in Hong Kong in the 2000s, kind of lifting the lid on this. I think what changed really is that in the the late 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, China wasn't really a military threat, and it wasn't making clear its intent. Hide your intentions, bide your time. You've heard that phrase before. And so it wasn't as evident to us. And then secondly, as I started off the interview with, we really had our eye taken off the ball after 9/11. I mean, remember, when George W. Bush took office, China was going to be the big threat that we addressed. Remember the spy plane that was downed on Hainan Island? I don't know if you recall, but
I do actually. I was about 5 years old, but I vaguely remember that.
yeah, so I was not 5 years old, and that was August of 2001. Now imagine if September 11th, 2001 had never happened. We might have woken up to this way back when. But that's a hypothetical question of history, like the one that you just asked me. We'll never know the answer to it. I think the message that I try to give to investors and to people who are running companies is, this is a really difficult situation. It doesn't have simple answers. We shouldn't talk about it in an oversimplified way. You have to deal with the levers that you control. And we have to hope that one day, national governments really level with their citizens about what we're facing. You've seen a great example of this in your country, for instance, with the embassy that China wants to build right on top of key communications lines that go into your intel infrastructure. The government seems to be totally okay with that, the Labor government. In the US, we're sort of waving our hands and saying, guys, you're in the Five Eyes alliance with us. We can't share intel with you if you, give the Chinese a capability to just kind of plug right in. So, it's a transitional phase. It's not an easy problem. It's very different from the Soviet problem. It's more insidious, and it's also more insidious because the threat is on our soil, right? It's not somewhere abroad, and we really haven't been honest with our citizens about just how significant that threat is.
Yeah. So, in your view, what ought Western countries be doing to try and diminish this threat?
Well, first you have to start by telling the truth, right? You have to equip your citizens with the real story, and we know the real story. And that's why we tried to do in Trump 1. Because this isn't a political or a partisan issue, right? This is for us and a threat to American interests or a threat to British interests. It's not a matter of politics, or it shouldn't be. And I don't think it's viewed that way now in the halls of our Congress. And I think that's a really good thing, because that's the foundation of policymaking, is to understand, right, the environment. On the economic front, we've seen the US government, which I can speak to, take measures to try to encourage companies that are in critical infrastructure like semiconductors, pharmaceutical products, PPE, gray zone areas like mapping technologies, et cetera, to pull out. And we've tried to encourage investment in those things at home. Some of those things will work out, others won't. But, take critical minerals. I mean, I think part of the reason why you saw the Trump administration back down from its tariff threat the last time is because China said, we will cripple your ability to build, advanced military weaponry and battery technology and electric cars. We'll just cut off the supply. So that's a really different dynamic than we had just a couple of years ago. So that urgency, right, with which we need to figure out how to friendshore or create incentives domestically for these kinds of companies to produce in our shores, I think, it needs energy. It has energy, but I think it's really urgent.
Mm.
Um, Secondly, I think there has to be a conversation with private telecommunications companies like yours, that it's not okay to allow adversaries to burrow into our infrastructure. This is a difficult problem, Daniel. Again, I mean, British Telecom, unlike our operators, does have has a legacy of government interests called British Telecom. But the Salt Typhoon hack that I spoke of, I mean, that happened in the infrastructure of private companies like AT&T and other Verizon and other operators. So we have to figure out mechanisms by which our government people can talk to our companies in a secure way, in a legal way, and help them, you know, steal their infrastructure to protect our critical infrastructure. We have to do the same thing with utilities. And then on the military side, we have to be realistic about the nature of the threat that we face. It's not just China. Again, we can't talk about this in a bilateral way, right? Iran is supplying drones to Russia, which is selling oil to China in exchange for, various kinds of assistance with their war. Yemen's Houthis have military capabilities and targeting information from China to target our ships and people in the Red Sea and elsewhere. So, we again, I keep harping on this, but I think we need to take a holistic view. I don't think we can view things in silos. We can't say we're going to have this economic strategy and this military strategy and this diplomatic strategy. It has to be holistic. But it took us 50 plus years to come up with that strategy to combat the Soviet Union. And my fear is that we don't have that time here to allow our democratic processes, all the arguments that we have, right, to work itself out across multiple administrations so that we can come to some sort of consensus about how to deal with this. I mean, the urgency is now.
Mm. Okay. So, as a sort of final point, we've discussed it. You brought it up briefly before about Hong Kong being a sort of vision for what a different China could be, at least up until the handover in 1997. Now, currently, the businessman and newspaper proprietor Jimmy Lai is on trial under Hong Kong's national security law and is facing up to life in prison. Now, you knew Jimmy from your time in Hong Kong. Could you explain why is he being prosecuted? And if convicted, what would it indicate about Hong Kong's political and economic future?
Well, there really is no distinction between Hong Kong and the mainland right now. So in a way, again, the language that we use, the way we talk about the problem is not accurate. Jimmy has already been in jail unlawfully for many, many years, so he's already been put away. The Hong Kong government is simply a proxy for Beijing. The people like Jimmy, who is a friend of mine, people like Jimmy are a threat to the regime in Beijing because he's free, because he speaks the truth. And there's nothing more threatening to a totalitarian regime than a courageous person who speaks the truth about that regime, right? Jimmy led peaceful protests. Jimmy ran a newspaper that encouraged free debate. And I'm using these words very deliberately. It's freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of organization. All of these freedoms are deeply threatening to the regime. After Tiananmen Square, George H.W. Bush sent his representative over to Beijing to make nice and to restart ties. And the message that the leadership, Deng Xiaoping and others, took from that was, wow, we did the right thing. We put down these rebellions all over the country, by the way. It didn't just happen in Beijing, with great violence. And, we really didn't get punished for it. So we need to prevent what's happening with the Soviet Union. We can't be the Soviets. We need to learn from their mistakes. And so therefore, they decided to double down on internal repression and, violence against their own people. And so they are acutely attuned to the threat that a man like Jimmy possesses. I think the way the British government has largely abandoned him and has refused to take any significant trade or political action against China is a disgrace. Jimmy is a British citizen. If that happened in the United States, I think there would be protests and it would be front page of the newspaper every day, but not in Britain. And that says something about the political system there that's not good. My fear is that Jimmy will die in jail. But, before he was jailed the first time, he went on a television show here in the United States, talking to Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business. And he said, essentially, look, I'm staying here because I'm the example. What mainland China is doing to Hong Kong is what they want to do to you. And you can watch these trials and these kangaroo courts, and you can see their vision for what a China-led order would look like. And you're not going to like it. So I think he's an incredibly courageous person. I think he's a godly person. He was a very generous man. He's deeply intelligent. And he knew exactly what would happen to him. What I think is, the failure here is of the former colonial power to really do very little to help him. And you had senior political figures lobbying the government not to. And so that's a lack of political courage. I think it should be a warning to other Brits who live in Hong Kong. Gosh, if you get in trouble, if we can't help Jimmy Lai, we're definitely not going to help you. And I think, there are a lot of lessons here for not just for the UK and for British citizens, but for the rest of the free world. And I hope I'll see Jimmy again. I doubt I will. But what we can't do is not learn the lessons that his saga is trying to teach us.
Yeah. And I believe you're associated with the Acton Institute, which produced a documentary called The Hong Konger about Jimmy Lai's career and his experience with Apple News and which
I'm not formally associated with Acton, but I was in the documentary, and I really admire that film. I think it's a wonderful film. In fact, it's not even a very political film for those of you who think, oh gosh, this is just an agenda. It's not. It's really the story of Jimmy and his life. And there's another, for those who are interested, I would recommend Mark Clifford's book, The Troublemaker, about Jimmy's life, which is wonderfully well written. It's a great read. It's a compelling read. And so for those who are interested in learning even more, I would also recommend that book.
Yeah. Well, we'll include links to both of those in the description. It's a pity we're ending on a rather grim note, but Mary Kissel, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you also to those of you who've been listening. Do remember to like, subscribe, give us 5 stars, and join us next time. So, thank you.